Hi folks, Matt Easton here. So I've been asked to talk about the difference between a Sabre and a Cutlass. And it's quite simple really. The Cutlass is essentially a short Sabre. Okay? So there isn't really a big difference between a Sabre and a Cutlass. However, there are some tendencies for Cutlasses that are slightly different to Sabres. So to start off, I'll show a comparison between. This is an infantry officer sabre and this is a cavalry sabre. Okay, so you'll notice that cavalry sabres are bigger than infantry officer sabres, and that makes kind of sense. If you're fighting on horseback, a bigger weapon is more useful than if you're fighting on foot. If you're fighting on foot, you want something that's a bit lighter, a bit more nimble. Okay, so a general tendency, and these are British swords I'm talking about, but the tendencies are true also of French and German and American swords as well. Okay, the tendency is for an infantry officer's sabre or sword to have around a 32-33 inch blade, okay, and weigh about 2 pounds. The tendency is for a cavalry sword to have a blade of around 34-35 inches and to weigh around 2.5 pounds. Okay, I would also mention the scabbards for cavalry swords are generally more robust as well, because they have to jangle around on horseback and they get more knocked about than infantry officers' ones generally. Okay, so you'll see that essentially a cavalry sword is a scaled up version of an infantry officer sword, or vice versa. Probably actually more vice versa. The infantry officer swords were probably, certainly in 1803, more inspired by the cavalry swords, so the cavalry sword more or less came first. Certainly in the period that we're looking at here. So so cavalry swords around 2.5 pounds, 35 inch blade, 34 inch blade, and infantry officer sword 2 pounds, around 32-33 inch blade. So there's not a huge difference. However, in the hand there is quite a noticeable difference, and if you're fighting on foot, certainly generally speaking for most people, an infantry officer's sword is far more manageable than a cavalry sword. However, with a cavalry sword, longer, broader, heavier, clearly is going to do more damage, and it is known that, for example, some officers by preference took cavalry swords even for fighting on foot, particularly if they were serving in places like India or Afghanistan or other places where they might have to more likely to use a sword. They did sometimes use cavalry swords, and they did sometimes use cavalry-sized blades on their regulation infantry officer's hilt. Now, let's compare that to a cutlass. So, clearly a cutlass is used on foot. However, as you can see, the blade is quite noticeably bit shorter than the infantry officer's sword. Why? Well, probably because, of course, fighting on board a ship or indeed below decks, you're more confined in space, and a shorter weapon is going to be more, probably more handy for that type of combat. Okay, so the cutlass is shorter than a sabre, shorter than the infantry officer's sabre, and of course shorter than the cavalry sabre. And you'll also notice it generally has a big, robust guard on it. Very basic, fairly cheap to produce, but they are very, very tough, big guards. And that's probably also because of the nature of the close-in fighting that was expected on board ships. The fact that that hilt in itself could be used as a weapon. And another tendency to cutlasses is they tend to have, not so much by the end of the 19th century, but certainly in the Napoleonic and first part of the 19th century, they tend to have, let's try and hold this so you can see more clearly, they tend to have metal handles, okay? And that's probably partly an economy thing, but also partly a durability thing, because if you take a steel or a brass handle, sometimes painted black if it's steel to stop it rusting, and in fact the whole steel hilt here would have been painted black originally, but the black paint's fallen off, to prevent it rusting, of course. The solid metal hilt gives a lot of mass to the weapon, but also makes it very, very tough, makes it practically indestructible, and of course wood tends to do nasty things at sea. It will expand and contract, and is just more likely to get broken or split or whatever in very humid conditions, and being knocked about, of course. So cutlasses are relatively cheaply produced, but they're big, robust weapons, quite broad, certainly broader than an infantry officer's sword, and quite short. But what's another interesting thing that a lot of people are surprised about, finding out about cutlasses is that whilst they're much shorter than the cavalry sword, the hilt is pretty much as big and robust. But this weighs the same as this. Cutlasses are often, for their size, quite heavy. Okay, so for that reason, they feel in the hand quite similar to a medieval messer or falchion or something like this. They're quite chunky, robust weapons, and this is a sharp one actually, and I cut with this, despite the fact it's an antique. It came sharp, so I chopped water bottles with it, and it's a really, really nice cutter. It cuts very much like a medieval sword, and in fact this outcuts some of the medieval replicas I've got. Very, very good cutting implement, and of course you can thrust very well with it as well. But it is quite heavy by standards of the day. Okay, so it's a heavy, short, robust weapon. And in terms of the fighting style, certainly in Britain, the style for using the cutlass, devised originally by Henry Angelo in 1812, 1813, published in 1813, actually formed the basis for the infantry sword exercise and then the cavalry sword exercise. So in actual fact, the method of using it is much the same. The only real difference between the later period cutlass exercise and the infantry officer's sword exercise is that there's no real attacks at the leg with the cutlass, of course, because it's got a shorter blade, and perhaps for the nature of fighting they anticipated closer, squashed in, you know, with bulwarks and people all squashed in together, that they didn't really anticipate that this kind of short weapon would be very practicable for cutting at people's legs with. So they don't really deal with leg cuts or defence of the legs, it's all kind of upper body stuff. But apart from that, the system apart from that, the parries, the guards, the cuts and so on, are basically the same as the infantry officer's sword. Okay, so it's used in much the same way, less leg attacks, but it's a fairly heavy but short sword. Cheers!